coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
To this very day, on a, maybe for some Americans a weekly and not a daily basis, but for many people still a daily basis, you cannot go through the news without having a non-consensual encounter with a Clinton or with another figure from that time. These political dynasties have done a marvelous job of responding to the Starr investigation by saying, like, well, if having sort of moral standards will destroy our dynasty in the making, then we have an easy choice to make, and long live the dynasty. That seems to have been the way that events have unfolded. We don't need to spend more time talking about the Epstein expanded universe right now, but it's all there. And you alluded to Megan Thee Stallion, and I mean, Clintons and genitalia, man. You just like peanut butter and jelly. 25 years, how many years? Lots of years. With no end in sight, none whatsoever.
Hello and welcome once again to The Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of The American Mind and associate editor at the Claremont Review of Books. I am joined today by managing editor Seth Barron and editor James Poulos. Well, we are into September now. We're in the thick of it, or I guess, the beginning of the ramp up or something. And we've got a number of disparate things to discuss. We wanted to start with this just spate of subpoenas that have come down from the DOJ. This is not crucially connected, at least in a direct and explicit way, to the FBI raid on Trump's home and the documents there, but rather to the ongoing January 6th investigation. It includes a raid on the My Pillow guy, Mike Lindell, famous in various circles for various reasons, but obviously having something to do with Jan 6, all the election fraud stuff. And they, I guess, grabbed his cell phone, but they also issued a bunch of subpoenas on in a bunch of other areas. Tucker Carlson on Monday went into some detail about some of these. He mentioned, for instance, this woman, Amy Kramer and Kylie Jane Kramer, founders of Women for Trump. And formerly, Amy, I believe, was the chairman of the Tea Party Express. Carlson says the subpoena claims to be investigating any claim that the vice president and or the president of the Senate had the authority to reject or choose not to count presidential electors. As Carlson went on to point out, this, any claim that any private citizen makes, false or true, is explicitly protected or supposed to be from the government. So worrying developments there, in addition to sort of just the continuation of these raids and seizures. Trump himself took to Truth Social, his new platform, and said, "We are now officially living in a weaponized police state, capital WPS. Rigged elections and all. Our country is a laughingstock all over the world, capital W. The majesty of the United States is gone. Can't let this happen. Take back America." So predictably Trumpian statement from him, but also, lots of alarm bells ringing in all sorts of corners. It's worth, I think, also noting that there is a traditional sort of 60-day time frame between, before elections. And we've got obviously midterms coming up when DOJ is supposed to attempt to sort of lay low and refrain from giving the impression that they're politically motivated or involved in any way. This seems true to the letter, but not exactly the spirit of that idea, because, we're kind of, I guess, technically outside of that window still, and maybe this is to get all of it out of the way before we enter into that window. But I don't know, you guys, is there new information here besides the actual factual details, stuff we didn't already know about DOJ and their plans, their designs for Trump and his team and followers?
Well, I still find it interesting, this idea that, I keep seeing like, oh, okay, this woman won the Republican primary in New Hampshire, and it's like she is an election 2020 denier. Like there's this new thing. It's replaced COVID denier with election denier. So anybody who has any doubts about this, deserves to be investigated by the FBI, deserves to have their cell phone taken. Who knows? Deserves to be clapped behind bars. But it's funny. Like yesterday, there was a piece in Vox. Okay, Vox is like a super liberal, website. And they said, here's the headline: Trump found the holes in our election laws. Congress is trying to patch them. The Electoral Count Reform Act, currently before the Senate, is an effort to, fix obvious defects in presidential elections. It's not a bold reinvention, but a series of bureaucratic reforms. It updates antiquated language, clarifies contested issues, and streamlines the process to follow. Okay, so Vox is acknowledging that the system is clunky, it has holes, it's antiquated, it has contested issues, has an unstreamlined process. Now, I'm not even getting into the details of whether this is what they're talking about, but there's it clearly indicates that there are issues, and the Senate has this Electoral Count Reform Act to clarify what the role of the vice president is in counting the electoral votes, indicating, that there was some mystery surrounding the question to begin with. So if that's true, then how is it that suggesting that, Pence, if some of these electoral slates are dubious, you're entitled to set them aside, which is basically what Trump's lawyers had proposed. Why is this considered high treason? So it's kind of funny. I just think it's weird that there's this at the same time that they're claiming that anybody who says this should be banned from running for office, investigated for insurrection. At the same time that the Senate is basically doing the same, having the same questions and trying to figure out a way to fix a system that they acknowledge to be broken or in need of repair.
Yeah, there are problems. We hear a lot about norms and how good norms are and how they shouldn't be broken. And then sometimes those norms are broken in the other direction, and in the place of sort of like a mature and thoughtful conversation or public messaging about the violation of norms, there's kind of nothing. And this is, I think, a deepening problem for the administration and the agencies it notionally controls. There just hasn't been, say what you will about Dr. Fauci, but he was a point person. He was the guy who went on the TV and said the thing that the administration wanted to be said to the people, and the people kind of understood that he was that guy. And so, love him or hate him, you kind of check Dr. Fauci to hear what the sort of official posture was as it may have contorted and pretzeled its way through the COVID saga, but a sort of clear channel nonetheless. And there's not really that channel surrounding the kind of J6 reprisal mission that is being carried out. And I think that has some real costs. This is not just something that is of concern to, the most rabid of Trump supporters. This is something that historically has concerned Americans broadly across the political spectrum, without regard to sort of which far end of which spectrum cared the most at the time about civil liberties. As it used to be the left, where you got sort of the most rabid left libertarians, and now I think Americans are all over the map on many things, but generally disinclined to look with comfort on a kind of haphazard and arbitrary rolling out of a legal and intelligence apparatus going around and just doing things to people and saying like, well, we're the people in charge, so obviously we're doing the right thing. Especially if there's no point person kind of walking Americans through this. And when there's seemingly no sense of obligation in the administration, that maybe there should be someone to do that. And, don't try and tell me that, well, it's the press secretary, because we know that system is broken, and we have seen the memes coming out of that office and coming out of the press conferences. And I don't think that anyone would seriously defend the idea that the press secretary is serving that role in any respect. And so, yes, the election is drawing nigh. And of course, there's 24 sort of looming out there. And what single message about the executive branch game plan here, and I guess working with Congress too, through the hearings and such, what's the game plan? Why is it what it is? Where does it stop? How does it stop? What are the mechanics? What should Americans expect? There's really just sort of this void. And the idea that voters should trust the void, and the idea that voters will trust the void, I think that's naive at best. And I think that there are going to be electoral consequences in this election and in future elections, unless some adult somewhere in one of those rooms gets it into their head and shops around the insight that America deserves better, and the American people do too.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like in this part of the strategy on the left, such as it is, like that point person is kind of supposed to be Merrick Garland, or Merrick Garland at least finds himself occasionally thrust into that role of making these public statements. But it's a very awkward position, because he's kind of a lunatic. Like there's not a lot that he's done to reassure the public that he represents a kind of neutral, unbiased, fair source of detachment. That's not really something that the people are, I think, already excited to trust the DOJ for, but especially not this guy who's like basically declaring that concerned parents at school board meetings are domestic terrorists. And then on top of that, they're engaged in this investigation, both of these investigations, but most pointedly the kind of Mar-a-Lago raid, where the accusation is the storehousing, the sort of unlawful possession of classified materials, which, like, you want classified materials to be classified. That's part of the sort of rhetoric around that raid, but it all comes across then as like, well, we can't tell you what's in them, and therefore, like, you just have to trust us that we have very good reasons for casting this incredibly wide net at somebody who has been an object of just like, attempt after attempt to delegitimize and unseat him. Like, it just all sounds extremely convenient. And look, like, again, it's not that classified documents shouldn't be classified. It's that you wonder whether they hear themselves, as James is suggesting, like, it's technically outside of this 60-day window, so we can't possibly be, engaging in out of political interest. And it's like, do they think we're stupid? I mean, maybe the answer to that is yes. We're going to talk in a sec about like another seemingly just tone deaf display of disregard for people's smarts. And like, maybe that's just, they just don't think that people are really as canny or even just basically concerned as they are. Okay, so we've got this speaking of this, general kind of attitude that the Democrats, that Biden's Democrat Party seems to be projecting, which is that like people just aren't going to catch wise. They're not going to cotton on, or even, I mean, cottoning on makes it sound like, there's some obvious interpretation of these events, less, but even just that, like, people aren't going to, can't smell BS, like don't know when you're pulling things out of your hat. We've got this party on the White House lawn on, I think it was the 13th, so yesterday or 2 days ago, and you're hearing this, to celebrate the victory over inflation. It was ostensibly, I guess, to celebrate the Inflation Reduction Act. And this comes like a day after, if that, this report showing that we're at 8.3% inflation. So, I mean, that's like a moderate drop from the staggering astronomic high that we had previously hit, but it's like, it's far from gravy. It's really not what you want to see. And here's Biden, right? This bill cuts costs for families. James Taylor was at this thing. Meanwhile, it all starts to feel a little bit like, Louis the 14th gathering his supporters to celebrate the new bread distribution program, like all the cake that people are eating out there in the streets, like as outdoors, the stock market tanks and food prices surge. We've got like this potentially brewing train workers strike that could drive inflation up again and also disrupt supply chains again. The places where costs are rising are the most just obviously painful ones, grocery bills being first and foremost, but we're still, again, like gas prices also dipped a little, but not to a point where you would feel like, oh yeah, this is great. Thanks, Biden. So I don't know, like, what's the big idea here? Is this just a sort of desperate effort to, like, if you stage enough like pageantry at Versailles, people will be too ashamed to believe their lying eyes?
Well, it's really funny. I'm just like the fact that they brought James Taylor out just cracks me up so bad. And I knew it reminded me of something. And I just realized what it was. Back in 2015, after the Charlie Hebdo massacre in France, like the French were kind of mad because they didn't, like, the U.S. didn't send over any high level people to deal with it. So Kerry went over there, John Kerry, Secretary of State, and he sort of he had this thing, and he kind of apologized. He said, "I want to tell you personally of the horror, the revulsion all Americans felt, blah blah blah." And then he brought out James Taylor to sing "You've Got a Friend." Now, just the idea that James Taylor is really so happy just to be trotted out on behalf of the Obama Biden like nexus in these weird situations. I mean, yesterday or the other day, he came on the White House lawn and he's saying, "Fire, I've seen fire and I've seen rain," which is a song about like this girl he knew who committed suicide.
Right, like a spiraling drug addiction, and like this is in rehab. I crossed paths with.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like a girl he met in the mental hospital.
Right.
So it's just like so weird. It kind of it's like it has the tone deafness. It's like the boomer tone deafness of. It reminds me in like when Reagan was president. But he was kind of like, he would always have like people like Barbara Stanwyck or Gene Kelly, like his old Hollywood friends would come to the White House, and I don't know, but I mean, and it always at the time, it just always seemed like hilariously like weird. But I mean, this is just bizarre. I mean, I kind of wasn't James Taylor. Didn't the Clintons always bring out James Taylor? And Obama certainly did. He had James Taylor sing at his inauguration. You know what? This James Taylor thing, it's almost like it kind of indicates to me, again, that Obama is running the show. Because I don't see Biden as being like a James Taylor fan. Right? I mean, James Taylor is more like
no more than Hillary Clinton is a Megan Thee Stallion fan.
No, certainly not. Like Biden seems like he would be more into listening to the Platters or something. I don't know. You know what? To tell the truth, I can't even. I don't think they've ever. I can't imagine what Biden's tastes in popular music run to. He doesn't strike me as a James Taylor type. This seems like it has Obama written all over it. But anyway, the idea that they're celebrating the 30-day anniversary of this bill Like, what the hell are they talking about? When there's been, I mean, they knew what the inflation numbers were going to be. I mean, then the stock market dropped 5%. I mean, it's so bizarre. It's
They may have,
crazy.
just on that last point, they may have sort of thought they were going to be a little better than they were. Like, some people did expect this report to be better than it was. I don't know why they did. I mean, all the things
the president has to know what the numbers are.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. At that point, you've sent out the invitations. It's too late to cancel the place settings. Right. It's like a bad wedding that you have to go through.
James Taylor. I mean, with all due respect to James Taylor as a musical act, I mean, who couldn't they get? Like, they couldn't get Bruce Springsteen to come down. Like, if Obama's really the puppet master, then like, gosh, he got a lot of notes. A lot of notes to get down to James Taylor.
Yeah, isn't he like buddies with Bob Dylan or something?
Oh, I mean, who among us is not a dear friend of this is, I mean, obviously the stakes are high and Americans are hurting, and the average policymaker does not want to find him or herself in a position where they're like working the levers and the numbers keep going in the wrong direction, and they can hear the pitchforks rattling outside their windows. This is sort of like one of those Veep moments where you're just cringing your way through watching these people who happen to be the people who are in the positions of power at the time, sort of like trying and kind of trying to have personal lives and trying to do their jobs, and it's just kind of not working out. And you can always ascribe some degree of malevolence to particularly bad policies, especially when they're being dragged on. But it does feel to me that this is, we have structural economic problems. Financialization has not worked out quite as intended. Once again, this is a case of like, well, but the technology is available to financialize the economy, and we don't do it first, then the baddies are going to do it. So I guess we better do it really fast. And by the way, if we do it first and we do it fast, then we can make all the money before anyone else does, and you're off to the races. And eventually someone has to pay the piper, and here comes the moment. The moment is here. The only thing that's keeping the wheels on the wagon is the relative value, the relative stability of the dollar versus other currencies around the world. So, if you want to thank someone for the economy still holding together, you can thank the dollar, because I think the dollar is doing more work than anyone in any policy position right now. Again, with all due respect, surely there are some folks at or near the top who have a genuine, personal desire to prevent this sorry state from worsening. But there are only so many tools in the toolkit. We tried to cut interest rates to the bone. We did that. We tried printing more money than there was in circulation, and we did that. Where else do you go? And at the end of the day, it's usually a good idea in life to celebrate one's small victories. But when what that looks like is, James Taylor singing about a friend who died of suicide as the numbers continue to tank, and the nation's railway workers are about to walk out on the job, maybe it's time to reassess.
Yeah, there's something extraordinarily boomer cringe about the James Taylor. And I say this as a fan. I mean, really, like,
yeah.
Big, my mom used to play Fire and Rain in the car to school all the time. Big fan all around. But there is like this, how to put, I mean, he's also sort of a figure of like, freewheeling, anti-establishment, do as you please, sweet baby James, right? A young cowboy lives on the range, and it's like he's gonna, by the end of it, he's gonna be like, playing for Lockheed Martin, like as he, rides the nuclear bomb like Dr. Strangelove or something. Anyway, but it speaks to the same phenomenon, I think, as I joked about, like Megan Thee Stallion going on the Clintons, Chelsea and Hillary Clinton's TV show. But it is the same thing. You know, you watch Hillary Clinton sort of stumbling through, like, somebody asks her, do you listen to Megan Thee Stallion's music? I do, and I admire, you know, how she embraces her sexuality. Like, look, it's not a new thing for celebrities to be kind of, you know, intimately bound with certain political narratives, or to be trotted out in defense of those narratives. But it does feel a little symbolic that, like, not only are the political narratives becoming incredibly stale, empty, and cringe, but the artists who are involved with them are becoming stale, empty, and cringe. Like, both of these things just feel very last ditch. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, do you guys think, like, people will fall for it?
It's hard to imagine that anybody would accept this and see it as like a great new start. I mean, I remember when Clinton was inaugurated and they had Fleetwood Mac on board to sing, what's the song? Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow. And even then that seemed a little like cheesy. And they were probably about like 50. Like, they weren't like 75. It just seemed really like
that song was cheesy the day it was released.
yes, indeed. But I wanted to speak to a parallel moment of unreality when Karine Jean-Pierre and Kamala Harris were asked about, separately, were asked about the border. And each of them said, oh, no, the border is perfectly secure. You know, I think Karine Jean-Pierre said that the Republicans were obstructing things. But, the Democrats control Congress and the White House. So the idea that the Republican obstructionism, to what? To keeping the border secure? They opened up the border. How could this possibly be anything that you can blame on the Republicans? We're seeing, like today, Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, because, we've got these buses coming up here from Texas. He said, well, we're going to have to expect to absorb a few thousand migrants every week. Now, these are people who are going to be, because New York City has a right to shelter. So they're going to have to basically rent every hotel room in New York City to house these people, to shelter these people. This is clearly unsustainable. It's clearly a major crisis and disaster, and they're just refusing to acknowledge it. They're just saying, no, the border's fine. There's nothing wrong with the border. Karine Jean-Pierre's like, I saw the border yes, I've been to the border. I went down there a few years ago. It was fine. We've had to really clean up the mess that Trump made of the border, but Trump closed the border. Kind of. So, I suppose nobody really wants to pay attention to this question, including the Republicans. But it's perplexing to me how they can just run with these lies, and it seems to be okay. Doesn't seem to be, fact checking seems to have ended.
Well, Republicans are also the party of defund the police and school shutdowns, right? This is kind of a regular tick now. And yeah, fact checking hasn't just ended. They broke fact checking with all these like Pinocchios that they threw at Trump for saying like that there were 5 people at dinner at his house when there was actually like a dog there too, so it was 6. Like, and then you turn around and they constantly run cover for Biden. So that is just kind of, a lot of it feels like people are just already locked in on a lot of this stuff. Like you said, everybody who loves James Taylor is already voting for Biden. And I feel like, everybody that trusts the fact checkers is sort of already voting for Biden. And like, there's who is being persuaded by these sorts of spectacles is a really good question, because there's like, a bunch of independent voters. They're important to capture. And especially with sort of Trump on the scene, who's always a wild card, like this is nothing is ever like set in stone. They have a lot of, as James said, like really serious issues to deal with, many of which are, to coin a phrase, systematic, but many of which are also aggravated by just like dreadful policies or complete disinterest. Like my feeling about this train strike thing, besides the kind of ominous signs that it seems to provide of like people's discontent with working in the transit industry generally, like even just leaving that aside, it's like, where is famous heterosexual Pete Buttigieg? Like, what is he just kind of MIA on this, as indeed he was? Gosh, when I mean, the whole supply chain crisis, he was sort of like famously absent. Took a leave of absence to adopt his kids, and then like now he's going on. Last I saw of him, he was like on TMZ blaming airlines for the fact that there's all these flight cancellations. Like, I am leaning more and more toward the nobody's in charge. Nobody really has any good answers to these questions. And, you know, look, Republicans are famous for also having bad answers once they get in power. But like, I mean, come on, this stuff is just transparently empty. Well, anyway, as I said during the other supply chain crisis, it's bold of us to assume that if Pete Buttigieg were actually around, he would be making things better and not worse. So I guess we should count our blessings and move on to another topic. So since we did our last show, we have seen the death of Queen Elizabeth just right after we recorded, and probably while you were listening to it last week. Obviously, Britain's longest reigning monarch, on the throne since the age of 25, 70 years of reign, 15 prime ministers, the dissolution of the British Empire, so on and so forth. We're going to do a feature about Queen Elizabeth and Charles and the Meghan Markle of it all and so forth. So we decided kind of not to do a whole segment on Elizabeth's death, but instead to focus on another famous person's death, and that is Kenneth Starr, who perhaps in all of the Elizabeth talk, her funeral is on Monday, I think. People haven't really taken as much note of this, but Kenneth Starr was 76, died on Tuesday. This is the guy, obviously, who was the prosecutor on the Whitewater investigation, which led via a kind of convoluted route to the Monica Lewinsky scandal. So it was an investigation into real estate investments when Clinton was in Arkansas. That investigation never resulted in charges, but it did sort of come to involve this sexual harassment lawsuit filed by this woman, Paula Jones. That in turn led to the relationship with Monica Lewinsky, then the famous Starr report, right, in 1998. Finally, Clinton's impeachment. At this point, we're in a part of the story that everybody knows or remembers. One of my earliest American political memories, actually, because we were living in England when all of this was happening, but we would visit during the summers from time to time. And I remember like asking my dad what was going on with that man on the TV who was talking about like sex, and just standing in bewilderment as my dad explained the extraordinarily American and extraordinarily sordid saga of Clinton and Lewinsky. Starr, after all of this, he was a vocal defender of Trump. He went on Fox News a lot, and he was even involved in Trump's team for, I believe, the second impeachment. So 2020, he got on the Trump team. So, you know, a long and incredibly eventful career. He was also president of Baylor University for a while, left during a sexual assault scandal in 2016. But, you know, this is a person who's played an enormous role in American politics. He's been, you know, sort of regularly on people's radar for decades, for really my whole life. And we wanted to just have kind of a conversation about him and his legacy. You know, the Lewinsky thing, looking back, to me at least, when I heard that Starr had died, I suddenly reconsidered the whole Lewinsky scandal, not having really thought about it for a while. I mean, Lewinsky has become a sort of public figure in her own right, obviously got very vocal or involved in like the Me Too conversations. And I guess I wanted to start by asking you guys, you know, Starr himself sort of said that he regretted how the Whitewater investigation played out. He said, "I deeply regret that I took on the Lewinsky phase of the investigation, but at the same time, as I still see it 20 years later, there was no practical alternative to my doing so." As an impeachment, one question that I had was, you know, to what extent is this similar to, and to what extent dissimilar to, some of the vastly more kind of histrionic and, in my opinion, unjustified, like, show accusations against Kavanaugh and so forth. Was this a harbinger of some strain in American politics that was just sort of getting started? What do we make of Ken Starr, you know, decades after Lewinsky and on the event of his death?
The memory that sticks out for me goes all the way back to the moment that the tawdry details of the Clinton-Lewinsky relationship began to emerge through testimony, etc. This was a moment when college dorms would have like printed out lyrics to REM songs taped onto them. Like, and there was this day when you would like walk down the halls and it would be like, oh, it's the end of the world as we know it. And then like, oh, it's like Rusted Root lyrics. And then like door number 3 was like the Clinton scandal exposed. People were highlighting passages, pasting them to the front doors. And this was like just at that moment when you could probably find as depraved of material on the internet if you really wanted to, but it was still like AOL CDs going out in the mail. It was like having an Ethernet cable was like a selling point for choosing a college. Like, it was pretty innocent, and nothing like this had ever happened before with a president in the public eye in all of its shameless glory until that moment. And for a generation, it was sort of like an introduction to the rest of their lives. Life has been more or less just as tawdry, if not more so, ever since. And it is, by any measure, it is strange that we are still made to confront just about all of the same figures of that era, with the exception of Ken Starr himself, to this very day. On a, you know, maybe for some Americans a weekly and not a daily basis, but for many people still a daily basis. You cannot go through the news without having a non-consensual encounter with a Clinton or with another figure from that time. These political dynasties have done a marvelous job of responding to the Starr investigation by saying like, well, if you know, having sort of, you know, moral standards will destroy our dynasty in the making, then we have an easy choice to make, and long live the dynasty. That seems to have been the way that events have unfolded. We don't need to spend more time talking about the Epstein expanded universe right now, but it's all there. And, you know, you alluded to Megan Thee Stallion, and I mean, Clintons and genitalia, man. You just like peanut butter and jelly. 25 years, how many years? Lots of years. With no end in sight, none whatsoever. And so, you know, this, if anyone had told, certainly me at the time, probably a lot of other people too, that the public display of Clintons talking about genitalia would outlive Ken Starr himself, I think that would be met with disbelief. And yet here we are.
You know, the original Whitewater investigation did implicate a bunch of like Clinton people who went to jail. And a number of them were pardoned by Clinton, like later. So, it's interesting that there are real parallels between Bill Clinton's election and Trump's election. The same kind of outrage that attended the election of Trump and disbelief, it wasn't quite as like broad as it was when Clinton was elected, but it was as deep. I mean, I remember people talk radio people, like so outraged that this total like carny, this like nobody had become the president. And it just seemed like, especially after 12 years of like rock-ribbed Republican respectability, that this guy had come out of nowhere and taken over. There was a similar type of outrage. And I think that, Democrats would always laugh and be like, oh, Republicans hate Clinton because he's so sexy and women love him and they're just jealous. There was, which I thought was kind of absurd, but it was visceral. And it was pretty clear that the Whitewater investigation, similar to the Mueller thing and the whole Russiagate, was brewed up just out of like very rough material. Like there was very little there, but they just pushed it. And, getting a special, I guess it makes you really wonder, like the special prosecutor, I guess it's now like something that's going to be with us forever. But I mean, people were talking about how Ken Starr had these like star chamber like powers, but he really did set the model for like Mueller and all the abuses and the way it can sap the energy of the presidency and just become this massive distraction. And these investigations inevitably uncover all kinds of other things. I mean, and then you have an impeachment, which, I remember when they impeached Clinton, I thought, okay, well, so this is going to take a year. And at the end of it, he's going to be acquitted because they don't have enough votes in the Senate. And, it's like, it's going to happen. It's just like a massive waste, a massive distraction. And for what? And then you've got the pardons. It is interesting to think about Clinton and Trump in that way. I mean, Clinton was just seen as like venal, sleazy. Like the assumption was that Arkansas is like the dirtiest, most corrupt state in the union. And he had to have been involved in all kinds of stuff. It's just a question of like finding it. A lot of the same assumptions people made about Trump and continue to make. Like, well, we know he's a criminal. We just have to find out what he did that was criminal. The idea of like, maybe a lot of the Trump accusations were patterned on things that they said about Clinton. It seems like it seems more solid that Clinton is a sexual deviant and a predator. It sounds like Trump has some issues of that of his own. But the way in which they would go after Paula Jones, who, she wasn't like a prostitute. They would just go after these people and like, just like talk about them in the most disgusting ways possible. Anyway, there's interesting parallels. And I think this whole business of the special prosecutor, maybe it's important to have them, but ultimately I think it's like a really, it seems really like, it's certainly extra constitutional, and these people seem to have massive power. And I don't know if we really want to have like permanent roving prosecutors like investigating everybody.
Well, they're all sort of tawdry, these people, right? Like you talk about Trump, and the really just like gross stuff that he says. It's like, the left acted as if conservatives were supposed to be appalled by that. But I sort of think that conservatives generally just have a very, like, especially, Christians who in America tend to be pretty heavy on total depravity, original sin, like the kings and princes of the world are just these sort of like disgusted, the worst sorts of people. Yeah, that's an important note, Seth, when I say the original White House thing didn't result in any charge, it didn't result in any for the Clintons themselves. But yeah, there was plenty of other activity around that. And this does just seem like, much like impeachment, which feels kind of, I mean, who knows? We'll see what happens if there's a red wave in November, but just feels like a norm now, which has lost, much like fact checking has like lost much of its sting or no longer has the impact. It's, you know, they're it's sort of like cliches or buzzwords. Like these are the sorts of things that lose power the more you use them, and the point of them is to be used sparingly. But I mean, on the tawdriness point, like I do think there is, in addition to what James was saying about obscenity on the internet more generally, right? Like many of the formal barriers to posting and publishing smut were already gone long before then. But when those arguments and changes were being done, you know, that people had no possible way of conceiving the tidal deluge of just every possible form of degradation and depravity that would soon wash over us all, you know, and desensitize us and warp our psyches and all this stuff that we're now kind of inured to. So like that was just beginning. Like this was kind of the first drip in that. But another feature of all of this has been like, okay, so, you know, maybe in general, politicians kind of stink, and like there's a long American tradition of regarding people that want to be in politics as themselves, like, you know, that's sort of a suspect desire. It involves a certain degree of ambition. And so, you know, you take it as read that even the best of them are kind of going to be like a bunch of jerks, or at least very cutthroat. So there's that layer of it, but then there's like our kind of elite decadence layer of it, that we seem to be living through a time when the halls of power and the institutions that shape our elites are uniquely deforming and deformed. And so they produce these people that are, you know, kind of abstracted from reality and often very unlikable and seem like they were cooked up in a lab, but like not a good one, like a sort of mad scientist lab. And so then there's that. And then there is just like, even if you know that politicians kind of suck, like most forms of technology, as James has often pointed out to us, like not only allow, but rely on people to construct their image, to like pick and choose what you see and don't see. And especially politicians are very good at this generally, but it just becomes and has been becoming impossible. And so now it's just like, you know, everything is available. Everything can be tracked and you know, posted and snapshotted. And so pulling back the curtain on the like just tawdry, sordid affair of this, you know, of Clinton and Lewinsky does sort of feel like a harbinger of that too. That it's just like there's no, maybe it's to some extent for the good, but like there's just no such thing as like a hero that we should all like look up to in politics, and like virtue is dead and the age of chivalry is gone and so forth. Like that also feels just very demoralizing, and kind of people don't really, I don't know what to do with it. Let me ask one more question on this topic, or tangentially related. You know, here is this, you know, Seth points out that Clinton is like a Trump light, or, you know, proto-Trump figure, in that he represents this kind of clownish buffoon that everybody thinks of as crass and so forth. And then you get Trump, who is obviously viewed that way, you know, in extremis by his opponents. And in general, we've been talking throughout this episode about like the celebritization of the White House and the use of celebrity in the White House, and the kind of like weird, cringe attempt to vampirically drain some like life force or youthful energy from people that like have a little bit of fame left in them. All the while, like AOC is out here getting this big, is it a GQ profile she got, I think, in, you know, about like in this incredibly precisely tailored suit, and she's giving interviews about, well, like maybe I could be president, but I might get, you know, my genius might be impeded, hindered by these pesky, you know, rules and restrictions, like the Senate, like there's a Senate, you know, we have this stupid Senate, saying also just like absolutely bonkers things like my boyfriend proposed, but I just didn't know if an interracial marriage was right for me. Like things that in any other context would be just disqualifying for the rest of political life. I mean, is this kind of like, do you guys have an over under on the likelihood of like the AOC mode of politics being the natural fit for this era? Like, are we staring down the barrel of an AOC presidential run?
Well, if AOC were to run for president, I mean, who's to say in 4 or 8 years where the Democrats are going to be? But I have noticed a very intriguing, you know, this whole new premise of run for just run for office. And I mean, you see it in New York at least, and in other places too. Young women who don't really have much else going on in their lives, professionally or personally, running for office in this way where they're trying to make themselves a cult figure. It's like a very strange phenomenon. You see it all over the place. There was this woman who ran for Congress in Philadelphia, this gal, Alexandra Hunt, who was running in a majority black district against like an establishment black Democrat who'd been doing this for like 20 or 30 years. And her basic claim to fame is that she, during college, had been a stripper briefly. And she just made this big deal out of it and and she got a lot of press and got some donations. I mean, she lost horribly, which makes sense. I mean, why is this like mostly black district gonna turn out their guy for this woman because she said she was a real progressive and he wasn't progressive enough? You know, that's not the district you're gonna. There's the same thing going on in New York. Like these women, it's a whole fame thing, and it's clear that AOC, what she really wants is to be super famous.
Yeah.
And I don't think she really wants to run for president. I think she wants to run for Oprah. I think she wants to have like a magazine, a TV show. She wants to be rich. She wants a house in Martha's Vineyard. She wants like all that stuff. You know, you always hear her complaining about how expensive it is to have to go back to have an apartment in DC and an apartment in New York, and what a drag it is, and how she doesn't make as much money as people think she does, and she still has student loans to pay. Yeah, I think she's in Congress for now, but I think she's got her eye on that Netflix money, that book contract money. So I think that's the route she's going to go. But that's just my little take.
Yeah, it seems hard to escape the conclusion that we are all going to face a fight to the death between AOC and Meghan Markle. I don't think that those two character types can exist in the same universe without some kind of major implosion of space and time. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, you know, as abrasive as the AOC phenomenon can be, you know, there's a special something about people we refer to by their three initials, and my opinions on that front are probably better saved for another forum and time and universe. But let's face it, like, she's the only remotely young person who matters in the federal government. And I think that is contributing to her attitudes toward fame. She wants to have a good time. You know, who doesn't? And it's probably a little bit weird for her to feel like she has no like peers or equivalents in a certain way. And if she knows what's good for her, she will take steps to counteract the reality distortion field that experience no doubt creates. On the other hand, if she did try to find some trusted confidants at that level who could kind of help her deal with the insanity of it, that would drive her into the arms of Meghan Markle. And as we've already established, that will result in the earth cracking apart and whirling apart on its axis. So it's going to be an interesting ride for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I, for one, I haven't broken out the popcorn yet, but I've checked the pantry and I've got like 6 packs of very buttery microwave popcorn. They are ready to serve.
Well, we've already had Meghan Markle versus Christina Aguilera, which was like a faint shadow of things to come. Aguilera called her a diva, and then she freaked out on air. But no, I think AOC's got like my money's on AOC. I think in that conflict, but they're visibly, demonstrably part of the same phenomenon, layered over one another in the multiverse. And with that definitive conclusion, I think we have to wrap it up for another week. So thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewofbooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. If you want to get a taste for the sort of stuff they do over there, first of all, you can go to their website, but also you can check out the feature that we just finished running on the American Mind. It's called Lies of the Ruling Class, and it consists of a series of, I think, really stimulating and interesting speeches that were given at a conference earlier this year. You can also donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate. If you donate high enough, who knows, we might just name a goat scream after you. Don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't give us anything but a 5-star review. We don't want your negative opinions. Thank you very much. Keep them to yourself. But do let people know about the show. It really helps to grow the audience. And isn't that what we all want at the end of the day? Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next week.